Hi, my name is David Jansen, and I'd like to introduce you to WebIDE. WebIDE is an environment for doing labs and programming exercises that can be completed completely in the web. Here you can see the home page for WebIDE at www.web-ide.org, and you can see we've organized a number of labs into sample courses. Each of these labs have been created in WebIDE and can be run on the web. Let me do a demo of some labs. So here's an example of a first lab that you might have for students when they're just beginning to learn Java programming. We're explaining simple data types and simple values in particular, like integers. So after telling them a little bit, we ask them to do something. So enter an integer. So they might enter 8, and they click on run, and it'll tell them if they did it correctly. But if they entered W, for instance, it's going to tell them they made a mistake. And you'll notice that the next tab is disabled until they have it correct. So if we have 8, good job, then we can go to the next tab. Here's another example where we're explaining arithmetic operations, and we ask them to put in the addition of two numbers. Now let's say that they're used to doing postfix and they make this mistake. And so when we click run, it gives them an appropriate error, trying to point out where the mistake is. So once they fix it and they click run, then they can go to the next step. Let's look at a second lab. This one is on functions. This one's a little longer and more involved, and so after explaining some things about functions, we ask them some questions about a particular function definition. Here you can see I've already entered the correct answers and run the check on them. And we can go on and ask them to write the function signature based on our description. And we can check that and give them feedback if something's incorrect. Before we actually have them implement the function or method itself, we can ask them to tell us some appropriate input and output test cases, so some examples. And we can check those to make sure they understand the problem first. And then finally, we can have them actually write some JUnit tests. And we can have them type in what the expected value is and the call to the function before they're allowed to then finally go and implement that function. And so we can reinforce a test-driven approach in how they're learning to program. Let's look at another example. This is teaching them about arrays. So after explaining some things on arrays, we give them a turn and we ask them to create an array of 50 ints, and here we can see we've made a few mistakes. We've made an array of doubles and it's only of size 10 and it's even spelled wrong. So when we run, it tells us some of the things that we've done wrong. Make sure you make it of type int. So we'll fix that, and then we can run this. Oops, we made a mistake on the name, and so we fix that. And finally, we made a mistake on the size, and now it's correct, and we can go on to the next exercise that they have to complete before going to the next step. Here's another example. This one is not so much a lockstep lab like the previous examples, but this is what we call a programming playground, where it's simply a place where they can write programs completely in the web. They don't have to install anything on their machines, and they can write in this tab the JUnit tests, and in this tab the actual code. And if the code is executable, they can run that code. In this case, it's really not. It's just a static method. There's no main here. But the test we can run, and we can simply click here and run the test and see whether the test passes or not. And finally, here's a lab where we're teaching students how to write a tic-tac-toe game in Android. Here at the first, we just explain what they're going to be doing, and then we step them through an overview of Android, and then some things on the manifest, and finally on the layout. And we embed in there a place where they're supposed to add something. And so they should know by now from their reading that what they're supposed to type in is Android : background equals at drawable /bg. And we can check that, but we've only entered one of the three things, and so it's going to give us an error message saying make sure you set the layout height attribute. So there's an example of several of the kinds of labs that we can create in WebIDE.